The first time we heard the footsteps, we both pretended it was nothing. It was just after midnight, the kind of quiet where even your own breathing feels too loud. We were lying in bed, half asleep, when something shifted above us. It wasn't the usual creak of wood settling or the soft pop old houses make at night. This was different. It was slow, heavy, deliberate. A single step, followed by another, directly above our bedroom ceiling. I turned my head slowly and saw my wife staring back at me in the dark. Neither of us said anything. We just listened as the sound continued, 3 more slow steps moving across the attic floor above us, each one controlled, almost careful, like whoever was up there didn't want to make noise but couldn't help it. Our attic hatch was in the hallway ceiling just outside our bedroom, and when we moved in, the inspector showed us the slide bolt that secured it from the outside. I remembered clearly locking it myself 2 days earlier after bringing up some empty boxes. There was no reason for anyone to be up there, and more importantly, no way for anyone to get in without unlocking it first. We stayed frozen in bed, listening, until the footsteps stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It felt heavy, like something was standing still above us, listening back. The next morning, I grabbed a ladder and climbed up to check. The bolt was still in place exactly where I left it, and the cord hung down untouched. I unlocked it and slowly pushed the hatch open, expecting to see signs of animals or loose boards, but the attic looked exactly as it had before. Dust covered the wooden beams, old boxes from the previous owners sat undisturbed in the corner, and the insulation showed no footprints or movement. There was nothing there. I closed the hatch, slid the bolt back into place, and told myself it was just the house settling, even though deep down, I knew that explanation didn't fit. The second night, it happened again, but this time it was worse. I woke up suddenly and glanced at the clock beside the bed. It was exactly 1:17 a.m. At first there was nothing, and then slowly, the footsteps began again. They moved more clearly now, pacing back and forth directly above us, dragging slightly between steps like something shifting its weight. My wife grabbed my arm tightly, and I could feel her shaking. The sound stopped suddenly above the center of the room, and the silence that followed felt alive. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. By the third night, the fear had settled into the house like it belonged there. We were sitting in the living room watching TV when a heavy thud sounded directly above us, loud enough to vibrate through the ceiling. We both looked up at the same time. The attic stretched across the entire house, and whatever was moving up there had followed us from the bedroom to the living room. That meant it wasn't random. It wasn't settling wood. It knew where we were. I stood up slowly and grabbed the ladder. My wife told me not to, her voice barely more than a whisper, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I positioned the ladder under the hatch and climbed carefully, each step feeling heavier than the last. The bolt was still locked from the outside. My hands shook as I slid it open and pushed the hatch upward. The attic light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the wooden beams. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed something was blocking part of the light. A shadow stood near the center of the attic, tall and still, its shape barely visible against the darkness. It wasn't moving, but it was there. I froze, unable to breathe. The shadow shifted slightly, not stepping, not walking, just adjusting its weight like it was balancing itself. Then the light flickered once more and went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. In the silence, I heard breathing. It wasn't distant. It wasn't at the far end of the attic. It was close, directly above me, calm and steady like it had been waiting. I dropped down the ladder immediately and slammed the hatch shut, locking it with shaking hands. We left the house that night and stayed in a hotel, unable to explain what we had seen but unable to ignore it either. The next morning, I found the previous owner's number in the paperwork and called him. When he answered, I asked him a simple question. I asked if he had ever heard anything in the attic. There was a long pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice sounded different, quieter. He said they never locked the hatch from the outside. My stomach dropped. I asked him what he meant, and he explained that the outside bolt had been removed years before they sold the house. After I hung up, I grabbed the ladder again and climbed up to look more closely. This time, I saw it clearly. The bolt wasn't part of the house. It wasn't installed properly. It had been nailed into place from the inside, as if something up there had locked it. Not to keep itself in. but to keep us out. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one, and don't forget to like and subscribe. When we bought the house, the previous owner only said one strange thing to us. He didn't warn us about plumbing or wiring. He didn't mention repairs or maintenance. As we were shaking hands after signing the final papers, he looked at me for a little too long and said, "Whatever you do, don't open the attic door." Then he forced a small smile, like he had made a joke, and walked away without explaining anything further. At the time, we assumed he was just eccentric. The house itself was old but beautiful, built in the late 1940s with thick wooden beams and narrow hallways that held onto sound. The attic door was located at the end of the upstairs corridor, a heavy wooden panel with a simple brass handle. There was no visible lock, no chains, no board sealing it shut. It looked completely ordinary. Still, his words lingered in my mind longer than they should have. For the first few weeks, we ignored it. We unpacked, painted, rearranged furniture, and tried to settle into what we hoped would be our forever home. Occasionally, when I walked past the attic door, I would notice how cold that section of the hallway felt compared to the rest of the house. Not dramatically cold, just enough to make the air feel different, like stepping into shade on a warm day. I told myself it was poor insulation. Then one night, around 2 a.m., we heard something move above us. It wasn't the light patter of an animal. It was heavier, like something shifting furniture across the floor. The sound came in short bursts, followed by long periods of silence. I lay awake listening, trying to calculate how the previous owner could have boarded up the attic if he didn't want it open. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I stood in front of the attic door and turned the handle slowly. It opened without resistance. The hinges didn't creak. The air inside felt stale and thick, like a room that hadn't been entered in years. Sunlight from a small circular window barely reached the far wall, leaving most of the attic dim and shadowed. Old wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and dust coated everything in a thin gray layer. There were no boxes, no furniture, no obvious reason why anyone would warn us to stay out. But there was something else. The insulation near the center of the attic looked disturbed, compressed in a long narrow path as if someone had been walking the same route repeatedly. The dust along the beams was thick and untouched, except for that one path. I stepped inside carefully, each movement stirring particles into the air. The temperature felt colder the farther I moved from the doorway. I couldn't explain it, but the attic didn't feel empty. I returned downstairs and told my wife what I saw. She didn't like it, but she also didn't want to overreact. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were clearer. Footsteps moved from one end of the attic to the other, slow and steady, then stopped directly above our bedroom. We lay in silence, both fully awake, listening to the weight above us shift slightly. It wasn't pacing anymore. It was standing still. The following morning, I went back up with my phone, determined to record proof that something was wrong. As I stepped into the attic again, I noticed something new. Along the wooden beams, carved lightly into the surface, were words. They were shallow, almost invisible unless the light hit them correctly. I leaned closer and felt my stomach tighten as I read them. "Do not let IT know you see IT." The letters were uneven, as if scratched in quickly with something sharp. They were old but not ancient. The wood around them wasn't deeply weathered. That's when I heard breathing. It was soft at first, almost mistaken for wind slipping through cracks, but there were no cracks. The breathing was slow and rhythmic, steady enough to be deliberate. I froze, my eyes scanning the dim corners of the attic. The compressed path in the insulation led toward the darkest section near the far wall, where the roof slanted low. I realized then that I had assumed the attic was empty because I couldn't see anything standing upright. But in that low corner, something wouldn't need to stand. I took one step backward, then another, my heart pounding in my ears. The breathing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. It didn't feel like the silence of an empty room. It felt like the silence of something aware. Slowly, carefully, I backed toward the door and stepped out into the hallway, closing it behind me. That night, the footsteps didn't just move above us. They moved directly above the attic door, then stopped. A faint scratching sound followed, like nails dragging lightly across wood. My wife whispered that we should leave, but I needed to know what the previous owner meant. I searched through the documents from the purchase and found an old contact number for him. When he answered, I asked him directly why he told us not to open the attic door. There was a long pause before he spoke. He told me they had heard it too, for years. At first they thought it was animals. Then they started noticing small things missing, items moved slightly out of place. One night, he said, he woke up and saw the attic door standing open, even though he had closed it earlier. When he checked, he found a narrow space behind the far wall that hadn't been there before. It wasn't part of the house's original blueprint. When I asked what was inside that space, his voice dropped lower. He said he never looked twice. He just sealed it off and learned to ignore the sounds. After I hung up, I walked slowly to the end of the hallway. The attic door was already open. The cold air poured out into the hall, and from inside, I heard a soft shifting sound, like something adjusting itself after being disturbed. I stepped forward carefully and looked up into the darkness. The compressed path in the insulation was fresh again, and this time, it led directly to the doorway. As I stood there, frozen, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the inside of the attic door, written in the same shallow scratches as before, were new words. You opened it. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The noises in the attic didn't start suddenly. They started subtly, in ways that were easy to ignore. At first, it was just the occasional creak above the ceiling late at night, the kind of sound old houses make when temperatures shift. I didn't think much of it. The house was over 60 years old, and every part of it seemed to have its own voice. But over time, the noises became more specific. They weren't random anymore. They sounded deliberate, like slow footsteps moving across the wooden beams directly above my bedroom. The attic hatch was located in the hallway outside my room, and it had always been difficult to open. The wood was swollen with age, and the hinges resisted movement unless forced. I checked it several times during the first few weeks after I moved in, expecting to find signs of animals or loose boards, but every time I opened it, the attic looked empty. Dust covered everything evenly, and the insulation lay undisturbed. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing moved. Still, the footsteps continued, always late at night, always slow, always directly above where I slept. Eventually, curiosity overcame logic. I bought a small motion-activated security camera and installed it in the attic, pointing it toward the center of the space. I told myself it was just to confirm what I already suspected, that animals had found a way inside. I mounted the camera securely, tested the angle, and closed the hatch behind me. That night, I slept with my phone beside me, waiting for the motion alert that would explain everything. At 2:31 a.m., the notification arrived. I woke instantly, my heart racing as I opened the camera app. The live feed showed the attic exactly as I had left it, dim and empty, illuminated only by the faint glow of the camera's night vision. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I told myself the alert must have been triggered by dust or a small insect passing in front of the lens. Still, something about the stillness felt wrong. It felt too complete, like the camera was showing me only what it wanted me to see. The next morning, I reviewed the recorded footage. At first, everything looked normal. The attic remained silent and empty for hours, the timestamp slowly advancing in the corner of the screen. Then, at exactly 2:31 a.m., something changed. The image flickered slightly, just for a fraction of a second, and when it stabilized, the dust on the floor looked disturbed. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest movement. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to understand what I was seeing. The camera hadn't recorded anyone entering. The hatch never opened. Nothing visible moved. Then I noticed the shadow. It wasn't cast by anything in the attic. It didn't match the beams or the insulation. It stretched slowly across the floor, moving toward the camera, even though nothing visible created it. I watched, frozen, as the shadow stopped directly in front of the lens. The camera adjusted its exposure automatically, trying to compensate for the darkness. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but static. Then the camera angle shifted. Not much. Just slightly downward. Like someone had touched it. The footage ended there. My hands felt cold as I held the phone. I didn't remember adjusting the camera. No one else had access to the attic. The hatch had remained closed all night. I told myself it had to be a malfunction. A glitch. Something explainable. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I left the camera running again. I didn't sleep. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. At 2:31 a.m., the footsteps began. Slow. Measured. Moving directly above me. I grabbed my phone and opened the live feed. The attic appeared empty again. Silent. Still. Then the camera moved. Not abruptly. Slowly. Carefully. It tilted downward, inch by inch, until it was no longer pointed at the attic floor. It was pointed at the hatch. From below, I watched the live feed as the camera stared directly at the door separating us. Then, without warning, the hatch handle began to turn. Not quickly. Not violently. Slowly. Like someone was being careful not to make noise. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The handle turned fully, and the hatch opened just enough to create a narrow gap of darkness. The camera remained fixed on it, recording everything. Nothing emerged. But the gap stayed open. And from the darkness beyond, I heard breathing. Not through the phone. Behind me. Inside my room. I turned slowly, my entire body shaking, and saw the attic hatch above the hallway standing open. The ladder hadn't been pulled down. The camera hadn't been touched by me. But the footage on my phone showed the camera still mounted inside the attic. Still recording. Still pointed downward. At the exact spot where I stood. Watching me. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your night with us. If these stories gave you chills, there are plenty more waiting. Don't forget to subscribe to Night Fear Stories so that you are able to enjoy upcoming content on the channel. Good night and sleep well if you can.